molecule dopamine is associated with reward. It's more about motivation and craving. So when I say dopamine is the universal currency of everything, what I mean is it's driving the motivation to develop new currencies. Big increases in dopamine that are not preceded by effort are potentially problematic. Let's think about methamphetamine. Huge increase in dopamine. Was the brain designed to release dopamine in response to amphetamine? No, the brain was designed to dole out dopamine, give out dopamine at a level and duration that is commensurate with the pursuit of some evolutionarily adaptive goal. It's like eating extremely palatable foods that are just blitzing your system, every taste bud, high salt, high sugar, high fat, to the point where it's just, and let's assume delicious. I don't generally like those kinds of foods, and then all of a sudden it's like, here's a bowl of rice or a salad. It's gonna taste like garbage to you. Human beings have evolved tons of technologies and currencies. Bitcoin, Ethereum are not topics I know a lot about, but when you think about dollar, euro, Bitcoin, Ethereum, you think about wins and losses in sport, in life, in relationship, in anything, something in your brain and body has to keep track of that. Did you win? Did you lose? What's a letdown? What's a celebration? And I think one of the most important findings in the last few years in neuroscience is that while the molecule dopamine is associated with reward, it's more about motivation and craving. There's a really classic experiment now that people use to demonstrate this. You take two rats, and the rats independently, separate cages, can lever press for food. Or they can access food. There's a little bit of dopamine that's released anytime they get some food. So we always thought that food, like many other rewards, like food, sex, warmth when you're cold, cool when you're too warm, is triggering the release of dopamine. But someone had the good idea to deplete dopamine in one of those animals. And then what you find is that the animal without dopamine still enjoys food, still enjoys other pleasures. So dopamine's not really involved in the enjoyment of those pleasures. It's involved in motivation, because if you make the animal have to move just one rat's length, believe it or not, to get to that lever, the animal with dopamine will work to go get that thing. It will work through some effort to go get the reward. Whereas the animal, or it turns out the human without much dopamine, can still experience pleasure. They can sit on their couch and cram their face with pleasure-inducing calories or what have you, watch pleasure-inducing things on the television, but they have very little motivation to go pursue things that will deliver them pleasure. So when I say dopamine is the universal currency of everything, what I mean is it's driving the motivation to develop new currencies. When somebody can sit back and say, I'll just throw this number out. Let's say somebody has 100,000 Bitcoins, which presumably now is worth a good amount, certainly more than it was a few years ago. The way they can register whether or not they are in a position of wealth or not has everything to do with the number they see on the screen or in their Bitcoin wallet. But that number is converted into a chemical signal that has everything to do with how much you had previously. So we could talk about the so-called reward prediction error. How good you feel with an experience has everything to do with how much you had previously. And dopamine itself is what's driving the human species to create these new technologies. And so while we think of currencies as the goal, it's actually what's really driven the forward evolution of our species has been the desire to go seek things beyond the confines of our skin. And when I say the common currency is dopamine, what I mean is the molecule dopamine, when secreted in the brain, makes us pursue things, build things, create things, makes us want new things that we don't currently already have. And so it has a lot of dimensions to it, but rather than think about dopamine as a signal for reward, like a dopamine hit, we classically talk about it, it's more accurate really to think about dopamine as driving motivation and craving to go seek rewards. That's the rat experiment. And it's a way of tabulating where we are in our life. Are we doing well or are we doing poorly? And that happens on very short time scales. Like, do you wake up feeling good? Or do you wake up feeling kind of low? Or on long time scales. If you're halfway through a long degree or you're halfway through your life, how are you doing? How do you gauge that? Well, it has everything to do with how much dopamine you were releasing in the previous days and weeks and years. So you're always comparing it, and all of this is subconscious. But what's cool is that once you make these processes conscious, once you understand a little bit about how dopamine is released and how it changes our perspective and our behavior, then you can actually work with it. So it's one of the instances where knowledge of knowledge actually turns out to be a really useful tool.
Dude, that's crazy to me. So one of the things that I get hit up about all the time is people feel stuck. And as you like really push on them to figure out why they feel stuck, they'll be like, yeah, I want to do that. But I just, I can't get out of bed, or I don't have the energy to pursue it, or whatever. And you get into this common thing that people say in mindset, and I really believe it, but I find it far more interesting when you're talking about it from a neurochemical standpoint, which is you just don't want it badly enough. And when I think about my own life, I sometimes worry that I'm either more malleable than other people, or that I have a greater ability to manipulate my dopamine release or whatever, because I'm very good at building desire. And I like the way that desire feels. Now, when you use the word hunger, I think people get confused, because I actually don't enjoy being hungry for food. I find that totally unpleasurable. However, being hungry for sex, I find incredibly, I feel alive, I feel focused, I feel energized, I feel aggressive. It's complex for sure, but I find that feeling the act of wanting something in the future, in that kind, or in business, and trying to build something. In fact, that's an interesting insight into my own self about, I like to build. And do we know, dopamine is the neurochemistry of the pursuit of making sure that I have the energy to go, but do we know how we can spike that?
Well, first of all, it's clear to me based on your description that you've tapped into these channels that release dopamine, because craving and wanting, whether or not it's sex or money or connection or anything, all right, that's the primary trigger for dopamine release. Yep. Now, sex and reproduction makes the most sense from the perspective of evolution. Any species, every species tends to have two primary goals. One, protect its young, and second, make more of itself, usually in reverse order, right? So even for people that don't want children, you might not, or people, of course, not everyone is having sex just to reproduce, but at a primordial level, that's what those circuits are there for. So every species, in particular mammalian species, where there's a lot of parenting and caretaking of the young, tries to make more of itself. And everything that you see, like maternal aggression, which is a powerful circuit that gets activated after females of any species, in particular mammals, give birth, they will fight to the death, and they gain superhuman strength in order to protect their young. There's a known circuit for that in the brain that gets activated once a female has offspring, and it's robust.
The other thing that I'm curious about as it relates to dopamine is pornography. I think pornography has become more readily available now than ever before.
Certainly.
I can go on any social media platform, especially X, and I scroll down for long enough, I will be exposed to pornography, whether I chose to go and seek it out or not.
Yeah, it'll find you.
It'll find you on pretty much every application. So it's especially concerning for young people who are in those formative years. But what is your view on pornography, dopamine, and the overall social harm of pornography?
Yeah, so this is a controversial topic because obviously people have different opinions on limiting personal freedom, right? Both expression and consumption of pornography, right? But moving that aside and just focusing on things through the lens of biology and the dopamine system, we know that the more stimulating, the more intense an experience, the greater the increase in dopamine. It's very clear based on neuroimaging studies that, more amphetamine causes bigger increases in dopamine than less amphetamine. More cocaine causes bigger increases in dopamine than less cocaine. Caffeine can cause an increase in dopamine, but it's not nearly the kind of increase, the peak that is, that you observe with amphetamine or cocaine, all right? So we can't just say stimulants, and we can't just say sex. We can't just say pornography. We have to ask within the domain of pornography, because we know that sexual activity, and in particular anticipation of sexual activity, okay, this is important. Anticipation of sexual activity raises dopamine levels. Then the question is, what is the range of things and the range of dopamine increase? Now, while there hasn't been a very systematic exploration of this, we know that, a lot of pornography is extreme, right? It involves more than two people. It can involve all sorts of dynamics that for some people are going to be hyperstimulatory, okay? So this is very different than, I guess, what people would call soft pornography, quote unquote, right? And here, these are subjective labels. So let's just pick a hypothetical scenario. A person is viewing a lot of, let's say, high intensity, high dopamine for them, releasing pornography. Okay, for some people that might be pornography of genre A. For other people, it might be pornography of genre B. For somebody who never looks at pornography, maybe it's quite mild, but for them, it's actually quite intense in terms of the amount of dopamine it releases. Now, what do we know based on dopamine dynamics? Remember, dopamine is the universal currency of motivation, seeking, and reward. It's not like there's dopamine unique to pornography versus dopamine unique to food. It's just a matter of levels and duration. If somebody is consuming, let's call it very intense, AKA high dopamine releasing pornography on a regular basis, what do we know? That peak in dopamine will start to lessen. It'll be lower and lower. And the trough in dopamine after they view that pornography will be deeper trough and longer trough, meaning they are very likely, we don't know for sure, but very likely to seek out more and more intense experiences to try and just get them back to baseline. Pretty soon, the pornography that at one time was very stimulating for them is no longer stimulating. Now, the concern here is that, and let's just be frank, we're not just talking about viewing pornography. We also have to ask ourselves, what are people doing as they view this pornography? This is a conversation that should be had, but I have to do it in a way where I'm not imparting moral judgment on any of it. I'm not saying people should masturbate or not masturbate. That's none of my business, frankly. This is highly individual. It relates to all sorts of things in terms of values, et cetera. The point is, however, that we know that orgasm is a dopamine-related event, and post-orgasm, there's an increase in a molecule called prolactin in the brain. Prolactin actually, in part, sets the refractory period in which there can't be further erection in males and orgasm in males, okay? And in females, it really depends. I mean, there's this whole world. I mean, Dr. Rina Malik is far more skilled to discuss this than I am about, different types of orgasms in women, et cetera, the extent to which multiple orgasms can occur in some individuals, not others. I think the general belief is that it's possible in most anybody, including males and females, right? But that it's more typical in females than in males, this sort of thing. Here's the point. Dopamine and prolactin generally are in a kind of a push-pull or seesaw relationship, whereby very stimulatory, high dopamine releasing activities and pornography and things like that increase dopamine, but repeated exposure to that, regardless of the activities occurring during that time, lead to big, long troughs in dopamine such that more stimulation is required just to get any sense of arousal. We also know that prolactin, when that is increased, tends to create a kind of subdued lack of dopamine. I'm using these terms broadly, kind of amotivated, non-motivated state. There are reasons for this biologically, right? After ejaculation, the idea is that animals won't then, or humans won't then copulate again and again and again, at least not for some period of time. The duration of the refractory period is highly individual. It's determined by age, by species. There's the so-called Coolidge effect. Are you familiar with the Coolidge effect?
I'm familiar with post-nut clarity.
Okay, slightly different. There's an anecdote that, at least to my understanding, is true. At least the Coolidge effect is a known thing in neuroendocrinology, whereby President Calvin Coolidge, reportedly, was visiting a chicken farm with his wife. They were touring the farm, and there were a lot of hens and a lot of chickens generally. And the docent who was showing them around said, this rooster here, pointed to a rooster, copulates more than 300 times per day. It's remarkable. And Mrs. Coolidge turns to President Coolidge and says, you hear that? 300 times per day. She's obviously quite impressed and letting him know that. And Coolidge, that is President Coolidge, says, but let me ask you a question. Same hen or different hens? And the docent says different hens. Now, here's the phenomenon, the Coolidge effect. It exists in rodents, it exists in chickens, it exists in dogs. people can speculate whether or not it exists in humans, whereby if an animal copulates, then the male is in a refractory period lasting anywhere from minutes to hours to days, depending on age, species, et cetera. During that refractory period, they can't achieve erection and or ejaculate again. But if you replace the mate with a novel mate, the refractory period is shortened substantially. Why? The answer is very clear based on actual measurements of brain dopamine. Why? Because dopamine is also associated with novelty. Now, the refractory period probably serves an important evolutionary role whereby it improves pair bonding so that post-ejaculation, post-orgasm, okay, here I'm interchangeably talking about these for males and females. You know, anytime you hear ejaculation, then people think males, et cetera. Post-orgasm, post-coital bliss, pair bonding, the sharing of pheromones, the sharing of stories, you know, the sharing of affection, right? The sharing of a bed to sleep in. These things are intimately involved in pair bonding. So I'm not saying that the refractory period is a bad thing. What I'm saying is that dopamine can overcome the refractory period, but the refractory period itself is largely due to an increase in prolactin that suppresses dopamine. So let's go back all the way to this question about pornography. What's the typical scenario? Well, this is not something I choose to think about a lot. You're talking about some individual in their apartment or home watching intense dopamine stimulating pornography in which they presumably are aroused or not aroused. They do or don't do whatever they choose to do, but that over time has less and less of an effect in getting them aroused. And keep in mind that none of this necessarily translates to real world human safe interactions between individuals, right? Pornography is very, very different than real world sexual interactions. So there is a phenomenon that is starting to surface on the internet. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are a lot of questions posed in podcast forums, meaning in the comment section on YouTube about, is pornography dangerous? Is it bad, et cetera? I think the thing that we can say for sure is that any behavior, any substance that stimulates a lot of dopamine and that is easily accessed without effort is potentially problematic. Again, big increases in dopamine that are not preceded by effort are potentially problematic. Let's think about methamphetamine. Huge increase in dopamine. Was the brain designed to release dopamine in response to amphetamine? No, the brain was designed to dole out dopamine, give out dopamine at a level and duration that is commensurate with the pursuit of some evolutionarily adaptive goal. Methamphetamine bypasses that, gives you a huge surge in dopamine, which is why people feel miserable afterwards. They crave more just to get back to a lower level of dopamine. Same can be said of gambling, in particular in people that are very prone to gambling addiction. Certainly can be said for food, for certain people that are very prone to food addiction. Certainly can be true for anything. But when it comes to pornography, because of the, as you pointed out, the ready availability of pornography, in particular, let's just call it intense pornography, or that includes a lot of different other stimulatory elements, multiple people, a lot of scenarios that can be accessed on the internet, right? Certainly not things I'm suggesting people go look at, but that is potentially problematic because it raises the threshold of the person that's viewing this as what is arousing, to the point where pretty soon they need those hyperstimulatory environments or stimuli in the form of pornography in order to get aroused. And again, none of that translates into the ability to have conversation with partners or the ability to, have discussion in real world circumstances. And of course, everything we're talking about could also be translated to real world circumstances, but the data really point to the fact that younger people in particular are consuming more pornography. So we're talking about bigger dopamine increases with less, when I say effort, what I mean is kind of the more traditional thing was, at least when I was growing up, was you'd go out on a date or you'd meet somebody and there's a series of events that would happen prior to physical interactions, right? So this is potentially serious and problematic. There's a lot of judgment, and understandably so, because people arrive to this sort of discussion with a lot of different backgrounds in terms of religious backgrounds and what they think is okay or not okay. What I can tell you for sure is that I hear from a lot of young males about their challenges with porn addiction, and they want to know how to get over porn addiction. And the answer there is difficult, but very simple, which is abstinence. It's abstinence. It's taking a period of abstinence from pornography, maybe forever, maybe reducing the amount. This is where it gets very tricky, very subjective, and it's almost impossible to kind of have the discussion without getting into some murky territory.
Yeah.
But it's a real issue. And I know it's a real issue because I hear from thousands over the last few years of the podcast. I've heard from thousands of males that are like, they were addicted to porn.
How do they feel?
It sounds to me as if they feel very dejected. And some of them actually have said they felt very kind of misled, like almost like this thing, this natural stimulus for them was dangled in front of them and they just gravitated towards it the same way that any biological organism would gravitate towards something that was triggering its dopamine system. And now they feel depleted and kind of stuck, and they don't know what to do. And I don't necessarily think I'm the person to remedy all of this. I certainly am not, but I think there needs to be a conversation, much in the same way that Jonathan Haidt has done an amazing job with Anxious Generation of talking about some of the severe detriments to overuse of social media and social dynamics on social media, in particular in young girls, and how we're now finally realizing that we're in a mental health crisis, at least in part because of some of that, and we need to pay attention to it. I think there needs to be a discussion around pornography and some of the challenges it can potentially present, in particular for young males, which is not to say that girls and women aren't also looking at pornography, because we know they are. The data tell us that. But it does seem to be more of a problem that's being vocalized by young males. And this, of course, dovetails with the whole discussion about dating behavior and how that's changed in dating apps, and how the ready availability of kind of the possibility or anticipation of a partner is there, but actual dating behavior and real world sexual behavior is reduced. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be discussed. And, ideally we would have a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a kind of panel of experts to talk about this. And maybe we do this together, as a service to the world, because I hear about this a lot. For instance, just by way of contrast, I'm not getting a ton of YouTube comments and emails from people saying, hey, I really struggle with, with ribeye steak addiction or with coffee addiction or energy drink addiction, maybe a little bit with energy drinks, but it's not crashing lives. It's not causing people to feel depressed, miserable about themselves. It's not causing people to have sexual dysfunction issues in real world interactions. I mean, this is also the concern, right? That young people are getting so attuned to certain dopamine dynamics related to pornography that they don't either get aroused or know how to handle real world intimate interactions. I suggest people avoid layering dopamine. You have one dopamine system that fortunately can be activated by a lot of different things. So for instance, I love the feeling of being completely rested, going into the gym or going for a run mid-morning after a cup of coffee, hydrating well, using the bathroom, listening to my favorite music on a sunny day. But that's a lot of things layering in for dopamine. And what happens is that if that becomes your hope and expectation, fine. But if that becomes your requirement for actually having a great run or workout, you're in trouble, because the next time it's not going to be that exciting and you're not going to be that motivated. You actually won't perform as well. So this year, what I've been doing is every third or fourth workout or so, I think kind of randomly, I leave my phone in the car. I don't use any music, and I don't allow myself any kind of pre-workout stimulant. So I have to generate all the force and energy and everything I'm going to do from internal processes. And you might say, well, that's kind of masochistic. Why would you do that? It's supposed to be fun. Well, I'll tell you, the next time when you bring your headphones and you're listening to music, you feel like a god in there. Why? Because you are secreting so much more dopamine, so much more noradrenaline, so much more effective at performance. But then the next time you have to throttle it back. And so I'm excited by all the tools that are out there, all the, there's all this like cognitive enhancement stuff, and people are plugging into every device, and they're trying to figure out, do I have white noise in the background or metronomes and all that stuff. But it's good to not layer in too many things. There are other examples of this where are a little more unfortunate. Pornography is a really good example. There's a huge issue now, right? Because pornography is so much more readily available on the internet. Now let's just remove the kind of the moral judgments about it, right? Because that's not what this is about. A scientific discussion about this would say that there's an enormous availability and range of imagery that's very powerful that feeds directly into the dopamine system. And a lot of people, young people who are growing up watching a lot of intense pornography, are suffering from a lot of sexual side effects and struggles with sexual interactions in real life, because those interactions are not as intense as the things that they're seeing. The other thing that's happening, I should just mention, is that I've got colleagues that work on this in psychiatry, that they are wiring their nervous systems to become aroused viewing other people having sex as opposed to them having it. And so they're running into a lot of trouble there. So what's happening is that dopamine levels are so high that real life it's like eating extremely palatable foods that are just blitzing your system, every taste bud, high salt, high sugar, high fat, to the point where it's just, and let's assume delicious. I don't generally like those kinds of foods, and then all of a sudden it's like, here's a bowl of rice or a salad. It's going to taste like garbage to you because you're at first anyway.
That's also got to be sort of trickling over to just social media in general and the dopamine release in response to that versus, say, for example, a real life conversation.
Right. Well, and if you're on social media and you're scrolling and you don't even know why you're scrolling, like you don't even know what you're looking for, your dopamine system has been tapped out and you need to take a break from it. Maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple of days. I think social media is great. I teach science on social media. I see you all the time on social media. There's a lot of great social interaction. There's a lot of opportunity to learn and see things. Some are funny, some are interesting, some are disturbing. But when you're at the point where you're engaging in something and you don't even know what the win is, but you find yourself reflexively engaging in it, your dopamine system is now plummeting. And that's a serious issue. So the other thing is that a picture is worth 1,000 words and a movie is worth 1,000 pictures. Our visual system is so tuned to watch motion and to see movies. So you're seeing movie after movie after movie after movie. What's happening is the context is switching constantly. The human brain has never been confronted with context switching at this rate. Television went from 6 channels to 12 to 200, but this is the first time that you can walk around with your television. You can have it in your car. You can have it on the phone, on the plane. So I use social media and the internet a lot. Unlike email or reading an article online, social media is, you can scroll through 1,000 different or 100 different contexts within 5 minutes. And that's a big override for the brain. And then the rest of the world seems kind of boring. Like, you see people at dinner scrolling their phone. It's because actually the brain wants novelty. It's seeking novelty all the time. These days, I'm turning off my phone in the evenings. I'm on there a little bit, but I'm finding I'm kind of sick of the phone. I think a lot of people are kind of hitting this point where they're like, I'll get on social media for an hour or two a day, but this is getting a little pointless.
Yeah, but you're right. It has its place, but it's nice to be able to connect how you're engaging with it, using it, and your feelings with science, because then all of a sudden you're in control.
Yeah, and I use the phone. I try and not look at my phone for the first hour that I'm up. Usually I only make it about 30 minutes while I go do my walk. I want to download whatever processing I did in sleep and write a few things down. The phone isn't sinister. It's our overuse of it that's sinister. It's like calories aren't bad. It's overindulgence in calories is bad. It's not complicated, but I think that knowing that the dopamine system is what got you started with the phone, but the reason you scroll is not for more dopamine. It's because you're seeking that big dopamine peak. It's subconscious, but that the amount of dopamine that you're getting from any individual post is tiny, 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 tiny. And then it's more about just trying to get back to baseline. So I say, when you, at first, any activity that's fun, you get this huge peak and then a trough, and then it comes back to baseline. But if you engage in that activity too often, the way that the dopamine system is arranged is eventually you're just engaging in that activity to just be okay. You're just fighting for normal. Fighting for neutral, as I call it. And that's addiction. That's compulsive use of something in order to just feel okay. That's not pleasure.
Just sort of related to what we've spoken about there, how can people become a morning person or learn to get up early more easily and more regularly?
Yeah. 3 days of pain, the rest is easy. So it takes about 3 days to shift the biological mechanisms to make you a morning person. Now, if you are a very strongly genetically determined night owl.
That's a thing?
That's a thing. So there are genetic mutations, they call them polymorphisms, that make some people night owls. They feel best psychologically and physically going to sleep at about 1, 2, or 3 a.m. and waking up somewhere around 10, 11 a.m. or noon. That exists. Not just during development or teen years, but that exists. Not just for social reasons. Other people are true morning people. They feel absolutely best going to sleep around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. 10 p.m. would be late for them, and they feel great waking up at 4, 5, or 6 a.m. Okay. Most people feel best going to sleep somewhere between 10 and midnight and waking up somewhere between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. or so, maybe 5:30 to 8 a.m. Okay. So those are 3 bins of the night owl, the morning person, and then the more typical schedule, but it's heavily weighted toward that typical schedule if you look at the general population. So if somebody wants to get up earlier, you need to stack the 4 primary, what are called Zeitgebers or timekeepers. So named because some of the early chronobiologists that discovered this stuff and the underlying mechanisms were German, as it were. So the number one Zeitgeber, the number one way to shift your circadian clock, which is this cluster of neurons that sits a few centimeters above the roof of your mouth, is to view bright light at a time when you want to be awake, AKA the morning. Okay. So that's why I say get outside, look at the sun, toward the sun. Don't force yourself to stare at it. Don't damage your eyes. Blink as needed. No sunglasses. Eyeglasses, corrective lenses, and contacts are absolutely fine, even if they have UV protection. Okay. However, if you combine that with another Zeitgeber, the second most powerful Zeitgeber is exercise or movement. So if you do some jumping jacks, you skip some rope, or you even just take a walk while facing the sun, now you're starting to stack different Zeitgebers. And I'll explain the mechanisms in a moment. If you then also add caffeine, now this spits in the face a little bit of what I said a few minutes ago, but if you were to add caffeine, you can entrain, as it's called, the circadian clock to be alert at that time a bit more. And I'll be honest, if I'm going to exercise first thing in the morning, I need caffeine. I can't wait that 60 to 90 minutes. If I need to jump right into exercise, I find it's easiest for me to do 30 minutes after waking, 3 hours after waking, or 11 hours after waking. And a lot of people find that the same. But of course, exercise when you can, because it's that important. But if you want to, quote unquote, optimize your energy levels for exercise, typically people will notice that has to do with your temperature rhythm. Okay, so we've got sunlight, we've got exercise or movement of any kind. It could be jumping jacks, could be walking. You don't have to do a full workout. And then caffeine, and in some cases, food. I'm not big on eating first thing in the morning. I don't like to eat until 11 a.m. or noon. That's when my first meal arrives for me. Just naturally, that's when I get hungry. It's all caffeine and hydration prior to that. But if you were to eat something first thing in the morning, that's part of the way you entrain your circadian clock to wake up, to essentially wake you up earlier. And then the fourth one is a social rhythm. If you're interacting with other people, you're going to entrain your clock to that as well.
No way.
Yes. So there's a social component to it, circadian entrainment. Now, the pathways for these are from the eye, in the case of viewing light, to the circadian clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. In the case of caffeine, it's more general. In the case of exercise, there's literally a brainstem to circadian clock connection, a big superhighway of neuronal connections that then so-called entrains your circadian clock. Remember, your circadian clock generates an intrinsic 24-hour rhythm such that if we put you into constant dark or constant light, you would still sleep for a given bout and then be alert for a given bout with a little bit of a nap. It just is what we'd call free run. It would drift a little later each day. This is what happens when you go to Vegas. This is what happens when you're in an environment without a lot of cues about the day, the sunlight rising and setting cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Sunlight, exercise, caffeine and eating, and social interactions bring your circadian clock into alignment with all of those Zeitgebers. So when I said it takes 3 days, if tomorrow you want to start beginning the process of becoming an early riser, you'd set your alarm for 5 a.m. No matter what time you went to sleep the night before, you're going to get up and you're going to do the 4 things that I described. Maybe leave out food if you don't want to eat. Maybe leave out caffeine if you want to delay by 90 minutes. It's going to hurt. And then by the early afternoon, you'll be dragging a bit. And you just have to be careful to not overindulge in caffeine, which will then cause you to fall asleep later. Then you want to go to sleep at your now naturally slightly earlier sleep time. The next day, you'll notice it'll be a little bit easier to do the morning routine I just described. And by the third day, you ought to be waking up with or before the alarm by a few minutes or moments, because your circadian clock has phase shifted. Okay. It's phase advanced, as we say. Your circadian clock intrinsic to you generates a 24
24.2 or a 24.3 hour rhythm. It's not perfectly 24 hours. And that we believe, we don't know, but the just so story is that it's such that you're able to then shift that clock in one or the other direction. You can phase advance, so you wake up earlier and go to sleep earlier. You can phase delay. How do you phase delay? Well, you're probably doing this already. Everyone nowadays pretty much qualifies as a shift worker by the strict and not so strict criteria of shift work, which is, are you doing any kind of cognitive activity after 9 p.m.? Are you viewing any kind of bright lights after 9:30 p.m.? Most people would say yes. So the diabolical thing about the circadian timing system is that it requires a lot of bright light, ideally from sunlight, but a lot of bright light early in the day to make you a morning and daytime person. But it requires just a little bit of bright light, even from an artificial source, after the hours of about 9:30 p.m. till 4 a.m. to quash your melatonin and make it difficult to sleep, or if you sleep, to make that sleep not as effective. There's a simple remedy, however, which is, and this is a beautiful study published in Science Reports in 2022, if you view sunlight in the afternoon, even for 5 minutes or so, could be late afternoon, could be sunset, take off your sunglasses, look in the direction of the sun, so now looking west, you adjust the sensitivity of your retina, the neurons in the back of your eye, such that bright light later at night doesn't have quite as much effect to suppress melatonin. It reduces the melatonin suppressive effects by about 50% or offsets those. So I think of this afternoon viewing as, well, first of all, it's nice to look at a sunset. If you're indoors in an environment like this, even if there are bright lights on, get outside for a few minutes before the sun sets. This is especially important in winter. Even if you can't see the sun as an object, get some sunlight in your eyes, and that will at least partially offset the effects of bright light in your eyes at night, partially. And I refer to this more or less as your Netflix inoculation, so that night you can be on your phone or watch Netflix and it's not going to disrupt your sleep as much, but it will still disrupt your sleep somewhat. But let's, unless, like Rick Rubin's very diligent about wearing the red lens glasses. I've started doing that as well. But if you don't do that, well, I'm guessing he also sees the sunset in the evening. He's very attached for good scientific reasons to the sunlight thing. But these are little things that take just moments, right? They're essentially zero cost that can really improve your sleep. But that's how you become a morning person. If you want to become a night person, you do the opposite. You view bright light between the hours of 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. and then you will phase delay or phase shift in a delayed way your circadian clock, making you want to wake up later the next morning.
I wonder if dogs count as social interaction.
Absolutely. And they have all of the same mechanisms we just described.
So I just thinking, how can we stack that everything first thing in the morning walk?
Yeah.
If you're in a place that's not Iceland or somewhere that's super high north, dog, social interaction, moving around, and then caffeine if you do or if you don't want it. But
if you have a dog that likes to run, you're even better off because it'll force you to run.
You're gonna have to chase
if you
after
have If you have an English bulldog like I did, you'd be lucky if you get out of bed by 10.
A little bit. Yeah, you're in
Their
gear
eyes
one.
are droopy. They don't like to move. But it is the case that dogs will naturally orient toward the sun. And people always ask, do dogs have the same mechanisms? Absolutely. Intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, the one that project to the clock and carry all of this thing about circadian entrainment to sunlight, are present, as far as we know, in every extant mammalian species, that's alive today. This is a system that evolved from bacteria that's very similar to the opsins, the light-absorbing molecules that are in the insect eye. It's a very primordial system. It's organized very differently anatomically in the retina. And to me, it's actually one of the more beautiful systems in all of us. In fact, the one thing that no one can seem to defeat, you're never going to biohack away, is circadian biology. This 24-hour fluctuation in energy and focus. Some people require less sleep, but we're all more or less a slave to these mechanisms. And, it's a good thing that we are, because it forces us to rest. Neuroplasticity occurs during sleep. It pushes down adenosine. It takes us through these natural ebbs and cycles of cognition. I'm obsessed by the idea that in sleep, The conscious mind obviously is not in control. The unconscious mind can geyser up thoughts. The brain is organizing things more in terms of symbols. Time and space are very organized very differently in dreams. And there's a lot of information to be gleaned from dreams. It's just that we don't yet understand what the symbols mean. The kind of classic Freudian Jungian interpretations are certainly not going to be complete, but I'm so grateful that we get this thing called sleep. And I think thanks to the great Matt Walker, we now understand that the whole thing about sleep when I'm dead is a really dumb mindset. And, my team at the Huberman Lab podcast, we sometimes joke that we win by sleeping. When we're in the peak of things, we all encourage each other to get rest, get rest. We really prioritize sleep. It's so essential.
What's happening from a neuroscience perspective as our friendships are getting weaker, even though our followerships and online friendships are getting bigger?
So at the neuroscience level, we have to remember that the brain circuitry, which of course is always linked to the body. We want to remember brain body are fortunately now understood to be interconnected. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that wasn't so much an accepted idea, but the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and all the connections to the body and back to the brain and spinal cord are bidirectional and highly interconnected. So when we say brain, I'm more or less using that as a proxy for whole nervous system, including body. The circuits that are responsible for feelings of social connectedness are deeply, deeply rooted in our need for safety. We could say this about any organism, but humans included need two things, I believe. We need the feeling of safety and acceptance. And so if we are to have a conversation about the kind of loftier words like peace, contentment, fulfillment, belonging. I think I borrowed that list, by the way, from the incredible Martha Beck. So it's not a coincidence that those rattled off my mind, but I feel like those four words are so critical to what we all want and what we all need at an aspirational level. We can't have a discussion about those without also, I believe, having a discussion about the fact that we have hardwired aspects of our nervous system, meaning genetic programs that are written into the script of all our genomes, regardless of color, regardless of background, that are just scripted into our genome that allow us to breathe without thinking about it, digest food without thinking about it, keep our heart rate going without thinking about it, elevated if it needs to be, slowed down if it needs to be, et cetera. And then hardwired circuitry that is there for bonding with our caretaker during early infancy and bonding with others of our species and evaluating whether there is safety and acceptance from the other members of our species. Now, these brain circuits have names, and we could get into that. They almost all have some connectedness to an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which sits above the roof of your mouth, which has many, many dense collections of neurons we call nuclei, responsible for everything from temperature regulation to feeding to reproductive behavior, and on and on. All the basic kind of housekeeping things. But connected to those brain areas are brain areas that are associated with evaluating whether one is safe or not. So safety and acceptance, then we can break down in the following way if we look at it through this neuroscience lens. Safety is really about the ability to predict outcomes, okay? And the brain, after being responsible for all these housekeeping functions, heart rate, et cetera, is largely a predictive organ. It wants to understand what's going to happen next to the extent that it can then free up mental real estate, neural real estate to work on creative projects or to build things or to imagine things, right? There's no creativity, there's no building in the absence of safety. Then it just becomes survival. So the kind of older discussion, meaning in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the discussion about the nervous system was we would hear about higher brain order functions and limbic functions, right? We would hear about kind of primitive lizard brain and more evolved brain. And all of that is frankly true. It remains true. And that language is perfectly fine. But I think if we are to think about safety and acceptance, we say, what is safety about? Safety is about being able to predict outcomes. When we are in the company of people, or we know we have people available to us, should we need something, food, maybe we need a monetary loan. Maybe we need a word of encouragement. Maybe we need somebody to bounce ideas off of. Whatever it is that constitutes safety for us, it's highly subjective, highly individual. Well, then when those circuits can quiet down, it's as if, they can finally quiet down and say, we have enough safety so that then we can start to explore iterating what we have in terms of new jobs, new creative ideas, new art, new
take a walk with somebody you care about, right? Those are not the sorts of things you do when you feel that you are under siege, either real siege, physical siege, or emotional siege. Okay, then acceptance gets a little bit trickier to sort of pinpoint in the brain. Acceptance likely dovetails neurologically with these brain circuits for safety, because acceptance is really about, well, given the range of expressions that we have, our range of humor, our range of political beliefs, our range of behaviors, can I predict that these safety mechanisms will still be there? These people will still be there. These things will still be there. Will they turn on me? Will they honor me, right? Will they laugh with my jokes, or will they decide they don't want to talk to me anymore because of my jokes? These kinds of things. Now, what I'm trying to not do here, and at the same time do, is to put a neuroscience lens onto these two things of safety and acceptance. But if we were to just take a step back and say, what do we know to absolutely be true? Well, safety and acceptance, belonging, peace, contentment, etc., come from a variety of sources. Certainly, in our early relationship with our caretakers, these circuits form that are basically all about resonance with the caretaker. Alan Shore here at UCLA has done beautiful work on this. I think the book's title is called Right Brain Psychotherapy. And it's really about how the bonding of infant, and typically mother, but or caretaker, the bonding of infant, and I'll just say mother since that's the more typical scenario, there's actually a lot of synchronization of brain networks early on, such that one's physical and mental state reflects the other, and so on. And so from the very earliest stages that we come into the world, we are resonating with other people. Call it energy if you want, call it emotions, it's neurochemical. Yes, it involves oxytocin, but a whole lot else. In other words, we leave infancy and childhood and adolescence, if we have a healthy upbringing, with a sense of predictability. Someone can be there and then not be there. They're accessible if we need them, etc. Now, that sort of relationship, that connectivity between humans and safety and acceptance in those relationships has been explored extensively. I think we've all seen the image of the mother and child and the brain imaging and seeing some sort of collaborative activation of their brain networks. That's been explored extensively, and it's beautiful work, and we could always use more of that sort of work. What's been explored far less is the safety and acceptance that occurs between romantic pairs, although there are laboratories starting to do that, having people, for instance, look at the face of their significant other, angry, sad, etc., while in brain scanners, even scanning of two individuals separately at the same time, those sorts of things. Far less has been done on this notion of friendship. But I think in this day and age when it seems like everything is more complicated, but I'm sure they've been saying that for decades, if not hundreds of thousands of years. What do we know about friendship? Friendship is one of the most reliable sources of predictability that exists within human interactions. Why? Because you can have many, many friends, and you don't have to break up with one friend to have another friend. When we're little, they say, who's your best friend? And maybe then you could only have one. But pretty soon we realize that we can have many great friends, many best friends. And I consider you one of those. Like, we're growing our friendship, but there's no sense of trade-off, even though, of course, time is always a trade-off. In fact, you were at a gathering at my home with many other friends, right? These things can be collaborative. Typically in romantic relationships, while there are exceptions to this, is typically a pairing, right? So there are clearly brain networks that are overlapping with the brain networks associated with parent-child or child-caretaker relationships and romantic relationships that involve the generation of safety and acceptance among friends. The major difference, however, is that friends throughout history, even when people lived in small villages, tended to be dispersed by greater distances. And so when we hear about the loneliness crisis, are we hearing about a crisis of lack of connectivity with our parents? Maybe. With our siblings? Possible. With romantic others? That's a whole domain into itself. You cover a lot of that and the challenges associated with finding and building healthy romantic relationship. But what we know for sure, based on extensive research now, is that there's a real dearth of close friendships for many, many people, not just in the US, but abroad as well. Now, we could make an argument that it's by virtue of smartphones, but I don't think we want to go there just yet. I think Jonathan Haidt's doing a beautiful job exploring those ideas, and he's far better equipped to kind of pinpoint the relationships, causal or otherwise, than I am. But here's what we know for sure. With friends, we can both hope for and expect safety and acceptance by virtue of having lots of different kinds of friends. Friends with whom we play sport, friends with whom we just hang out, friends with whom we don't really talk too much at all, and friends with whom we drop into deep conversation with. So one of the things that I personally have found to be immensely beneficial in my own life, and for which it's clearly had an outsized positive effect relative to the time required, is a simple good morning text that comes on a reliable schedule, meaning every single morning. Now, this might sound almost trivial, but when I wake up in the morning, I either receive or send a good morning text to, right now there are about 3 people in that kind of collection. They're not talking to each other. But if I don't receive that text by noon, it activates something in me. It's not a ton of anxiety, but it activates something. Are they okay? What's going on with them? It isn't, why aren't they checking up on me? I assume something's come up. But the simple receival of a text from somebody saying good morning, I think has both ancient and modern significance. Ancient in the sense that one of the first things that everyone experienced when we lived in small villages, because that's essentially how we evolved, was to see faces of other, what biologists call conspecifics, and other same non-conspecific people, like people that could be romantic partners or family members or people we were going to work with. We saw faces first thing in the morning. And we know with certainty, because there's a ton of beautiful work, mainly from Nancy Kanwisher's laboratory at MIT, a brilliant researcher, as well as a woman named Doris Sau, who now is at Berkeley, was at Caltech, that there's an immense amount of neural real estate devoted to the processing of faces, not just facial expressions, but human faces in particular. Now, monkeys have the same brain area for monkey faces. So this is not an area that's just designed to see eyes, nose, and mouth. It's a brain area that has neural real estate that responds specifically to the faces of other humans in humans. And there's a whole lot to talk about how it's connected with areas of the brain involved in emotion and emotion regulation, et cetera. But the simple act of sending a good morning text to one person and receiving that back, perhaps exchanging a note or two about what's your plan for the day, doesn't have to be an extensive back and forth, but the same person or persons consistently, I've experienced in my own life in times both good and bad and kind of neutral, that it has this outsized positive effect. And I don't think that's because I was lacking social interaction. My life is very full. I have a very busy business life. I can go online and see faces. But when we go online and see a familiar influencer or a familiar political figure or a familiar even family member, yes, they're there. And I think there's great power to that. But they aren't there specifically to see us. Although as creators, we know that we are there to see our audience and for them to see us. That's a real thing. But it's quite different to have this exchange, this reciprocity. And I really believe that if there was one thing that we could each and all do to better our lives, no matter how busy our social schedule or our at-home environments, is to have at least one, but probably 1 to 3, depending on your bandwidth, 1 to 3 friends that every single morning when you wake up, you text them and they text you back. Just a simple good morning. Why? Because it's the reliability. It's this notion of expectation being fulfilled. It's not a huge expectation. And this brings us back to safety and acceptance, right? No one's going to text us good morning if they don't accept us, if they dismiss us. And the safety is in the predictability of the interaction. Now, for people that walk to the corner and they see the barista and they get their coffee or they see their neighbor, et cetera, the importance of saying hello to people on the street, this is something that's really fallen away these days. Depends on where you live, but people are very much in their phones. People are very much afraid, frankly, of how they will be reacted to if they were to reach out to somebody that they don't know. These basic human interactions take us back hundreds, if not thousands, maybe even tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And if I were to put my money on any experiment, it would be that there is dedicated neural machinery for these sorts of practices. And while social media has wonderful contributions and significance to make in the well-being of our lives, I truly believe that. I am absolutely certain that these simple practices, just as morning sunlight can profoundly affect our daytime mood, focus, and alertness and nighttime sleep, I think these simple practices of saying good morning by text each morning to the same person or people and receiving a text back sets something on the shelf like, okay, we're good to move forward through the day.
We live in a world of substances.
Yes.
I mean, we all have to eat. We all have to hydrate. I'm drinking caffeine right now.
Right.
Let's take nicotine first.
Yes.
I have a colleague, not at Stanford, who has a Nobel Prize, who chews Nicorette. Why? I asked him why, and he said, well, for years he was a smoker, and it allowed him to focus. And then he realized that lung cancer is something he doesn't want, so he quit, and he couldn't focus as well, so he started chewing Nicorette.
Yeah.
That's right. Constantly throughout the day. Nicorette stimulates acetylcholine receptors called nicotine receptors, and they are located in multiple places in the brain and body, but they are highly enriched in an area of the forebrain called nucleus basalis that increases focus and the ability to focus. So nicotine increases focus.
Okay.
I won't lie, it does. It's the smoking part that can mess you up. And nowadays I see a lot of people vaping. That seems to be a big thing. And that's a big concern with kids. And again, now I'm not a parent and I'm sounding like a parent, but I think
what does vaping do to the brain though?
Well, they're becoming highly addicted to nicotine stimulation. And it's very, very hard to quit nicotine stimulation because the level of pleasure and focus that you get from nicotine stimulation is significant. You get a dopamine increase and the nicotine increase, and that makes you feel motivated and focused. It's like the perfect storm of chemicals to allow you to do really focused work. And so nicotine, and because it increases dopamine and acetylcholine, is this magic elixir for motivation and focus. But it's potentially addictive and hazardous in some cases.
Got it.
I actually have several friends that dip Nicorette all day long. Some people feel sick doing it. Some people love it. I should mention some safer alternatives, perhaps.
Sure.
This isn't really about supplements, but there is something called alpha GPC, which I occasionally take, 300 milligrams of alpha GPC to do a work bout. It does increase focus because it increases acetylcholine release.
Got it.
There is some evidence that alpha GPC at, I think, 600 to 900 milligrams per day can offset some of the mental decline associated with Alzheimer's and aging. But this is an over-the-counter thing. People have to check with their doctor.
Right.
Okay, so that's nicotine. That's how that works. But that's why people smoke. That's why they take Nicorette. That's why people are vaping. And that's why people are taking alpha GPC. And nowadays, the whole business of nootropics is, smart drugs are mainly geared towards, mainly consist of things that have caffeine to increase adrenaline for alertness and dopamine for motivation, and things that increase acetylcholine and things like alpha GPC.
Got it.
Okay. Then there's alcohol, and alcohol is more of a sedative. Alcohol's main effect is to reduce the amount of activity in the forebrain, which is involved in planning and inhibiting. It's involved in the no-goes.
Right.
Right. It's also involved in the sense of self and your self-image, who you think you are in the world. It's kind of interesting. So when people have a drink or two, they feel less inhibited. They also, at least at the early stages of drinking, they tend to feel more confident. They tend to continue drinking, then they tend to lose their self-image. They forget who they are. They can even go blackout drunk.
Wow.
And the downstream chemicals are interesting. For a small, maybe 8% of the population, alcohol causes a huge dopamine increase. These are the people that from the first drink, they discover that they are an alcoholic or very prone to alcoholism. I've known people like this. Then these are the people that can drink like nobody else. It's not just a tolerance, it's that dopamine system kicking in. Whereas for most people, it's more of a sedative. It works through the so-called GABA system, and it's more of just kind of a tranquilizer to shut everything down.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
But it doesn't help you focus.
No. So a lot of people self-medicate so being alert is a prerequisite to being focused, but being too alert makes it hard to focus because then your spotlights are going all over the place. Some people use alcohol as a way to reduce that level of alertness slightly and get into kind of a groove where they can, focus a little better than they would otherwise.
Got it.
Ideally, you would know how to do that without the alcohol, but a lot of people use alcohol for that reason.
Right. Okay.
I'm going to make some enemies here, but I have family members who will say, I need a drink. People will say, I need a drink. That is a sign of somebody that can't regulate their nervous system, right? Like, I need a cup of coffee and I'm not being disparaging of these statements. I've said I need a cup of coffee. But what you're really saying is that your system requires this chemical to get a lift. It's not a crime for most people, but if you need a drink in order to relax, in my mind, you don't actually have control over your nervous system.
Wow.
That's, no judgment, but it would be wise to try and develop some behavioral tools that could perhaps work alongside your pharmacology, if that's what you want, if you still want to pursue pharmacology.
Yeah.
And then there's cannabis. And there we have to divide nowadays among CBD versus THC, and the potency of a lot of edibles and people smoking cannabis. The potency has gone way, way up. So there's big dopamine increases, big serotonin increases, which is the kind of mellowing effect or the lack of anxiety. And then, of course, there's this huge array of strains now where, anytime I tell a really seasoned pot smoker that I don't like cannabis, I just don't. Admittedly, I tried it many years ago. I did inhale and I didn't like it. And so I didn't do it again. But I'm told that there are now many different strains, some of which have a certain type of psychoactive effects and make people focused and alert, others that make them more sleepy.
Interesting.
There's a huge array of effects. Dopamine, serotonin, and what's called the cannabinoid system. And this is interesting. The cannabinoid receptors are actually named because they bind cannabis, are in the hippocampus and other areas of the body. They're involved in pain modulation. Not surprisingly, a lot of people will smoke cannabis for chronic pain or for glaucoma because it reduces eye pressure. And it's a disease of pressure in the eye. And it's involved in learning, memory, and forgetting.
Oh,
that's right. So
wait, it's involved in forgetting.
That's right.
Not remembering.
Correct. So stimulation of the cannabinoid system makes you more prone to forget things.
Wow.
And let's just put it this way: pot smokers are not. They're not savants when it comes to remembering things. And if they are, it's fair to say that they would be better at remembering things if they didn't use cannabis.
Interesting.
But again, I want to be clear what my stance is on this, because I know that many people derive great benefit from some of these things.
Yes.
And provided it's done legally, age appropriate, et cetera, again, no judgment. I think that there are people who derive benefit. And it's a question of context. And the one context that we know this is very problematic, all of this is problematic, is in the developing brain. Because up until about age 25, the amount of neuroplasticity that you can get from any single event, chemical or behavioral or otherwise, is very robust. And so if people are growing up using a lot of a particular drug, then the brain is reshaping, and those dopamine circuits are reshaping, and those serotonin circuits are reshaping according to that chemical environment. And so I think it's important to know that. Yeah. And so for some people, for instance, who relied heavily on ADHD drugs, Ritalin and Adderall, during childhood, it's very hard for them to come off as adults.
Yes.
And again, there are drugs like modafinil, armodafinil, Ritalin, Adderall that have helped millions of people. And there are also millions of people who are relying on these compounds who probably don't need them, but they aren't aware of some of the other protocols and approaches.
Right.
So it's sort of a situation whereby the pharmacology is very potent, it's available, and so people go to the lowest hanging fruit.
Right.
The problem is not pleasures. The problem is that pleasure experienced without prior requirement for pursuit is terrible for us. It's terrible for us as individuals. It's terrible for us as groups. And I have great confidence in the human species to work this out. But we are finding now, and we are going to increasingly find, that those who will be successful, young or old, are going to be those people who can create their own internal buffers. They're going to be able to control their relationship to pleasures, because the proximity to pleasures and the availability is the problem. If you look at the increase in use of drugs of abuse or prescription medication, which at least at the first pass deliver pleasure, pain relief, the whole issue with the opioid crisis, and dopaminergic drugs like Ritalin, Adderall, there sometimes is a clinical need, but tons of people are taking those recreationally now or to study. Huge dopamine increases are what those cause. That is a problem. That's a serious problem, because it creates a cycle where you need more of that specific thing. I always say addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure.
God, that's such a good definition.
And I don't like to comment too much on enlightenment, because I don't really know what that is as a neurobiologist, but a good life, we could say, is a progressive expansion of the things that bring you pleasure. And even better, a good life is a progressive expansion of the things that bring you pleasure and includes pleasure through motivation and hard work. And understanding this pain-pleasure balance, whereby if you experience pain and you can continue to be in that friction and exert effort, the rewards are that much greater when they arrive. And so I think that if you look at any drug of abuse or any situation where somebody isn't motivated or thinks that, now they may have clinically diagnosed attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but a lot of what people think is ADHD, it turns out, is people just over-consuming dopamine from various sources. And also the context within a TikTok feed is, the context switch is insane. The brain has never seen, first of all, this is the first time in human evolution that we wrote with our thumbs, but that's a pretty benign shift. And then the other shift is, normally you walk from one room to another, or from a field into the trees, or from a hut or a house, or whatever it is. But now you can get 10,000 context switches in that 30 minutes of scrolling on Instagram or TikTok. And so it's all about self-regulation. We are going to select for the people that can self-regulate. And so then people say, well, how do you self-regulate? How do kids self-regulate? Well, this is my hope, and one of the reasons I've gotten excited about public education and teaching neuroscience is that this is a place where knowledge of knowledge actually can allow oneself to intervene. When you think, I'm feeling low, I don't feel good, nothing really feels like good. Am I depressed? Maybe, but maybe you've saturated the dopamine circuits. You're now in the pain part of things. What do? Well, you have to stop. You need to replenish dopamine. You need to stop engaging with this behavior, and then your pleasure for it will come back. But you have to constantly control the hinge. It's not just about being back and forth on the seesaw. You have to make sure the hinge doesn't get stuck in pain or in pleasure. So it's a dynamic process being a human being. It's not easy. And remember, these circuits didn't evolve for this purpose. They evolved primarily for making more of ourselves. That's why they're so closely tied to the reproductive circuits. And that's why it was interesting and very relevant that you said that your desire to have sex with your wife is one of the most powerful feelings. And it kind of, from a neurochemical perspective, it wicks out into all these other pursuits, right? Mm-hmm. Those other pursuits aren't about sex per se, but it's the same molecule. So the feeling is the same. It's just that for some people, the amplitude of that dopamine signal for craving sex is very high. For some people, that's lower, and it's higher for video games. Whatever you lean into and you think about often in these pursuits will start to reshape these circuits, because these dopaminergic circuits are tied to everything. There are examples of people getting addicted to the most incredible things. There are also examples of people getting very good but not addicted to chess, for instance. It's all the same general set of mechanisms.
So let me ask you about the role of the prefrontal cortex in what you described as rule switching, because I would like to know what you think about whether or not the prefrontal cortex is actually, let's say, switching rules, or if what it's doing is switching context-sensitive behavioral patterns that when we talk about, we describe as rules.
It is the critical question that you're asking. The prefrontal cortex, in particular the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is in an incredibly unique position to not only establish different rules depending on context. And the way it does that is by accessing memory. So the hippocampus has access to prefrontal cortex and vice versa. It's almost always a reciprocal conversation. So it can pull memory thinking, the last time I responded like that didn't get me the result I wanted. Or the last time I responded in this other way, I got the result I wanted. Again, regardless of situation. Mm-hmm. The other thing that the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is exquisitely positioned to do, and this is beautiful work of a colleague of mine by the name of Nolan Williams, also in psychiatry, is because of its connections to some structures that then feed into the vagus nerve, it actually can slow the heart rate down. So in other words, let's say someone says something and your immediate impulse is to fight or to respond in a kind of knee-jerk way. If you halt, right, I guess what the meditators and the mindfulness folks was called the gap, or if you can access some memory and think, and you might be thinking, actually there's a much better way to place the dart if I just kind of lean back a little bit, or it could be, silence might be the best response, right? Or it could be that you're going to carefully access some data from your hippocampus to respond in a way that is most effective. For instance, here I'm talking about confrontation, but it could be any situation. The left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does two things. As it acquires a new rule set, or starts to access information about a new or possible rule set, it also sends a parallel signal to slow the heart down through the vagus nerve. And that is, I think, one of the more important and fascinating discoveries in the last 5 years. Those aren't data from my laboratory. I wish they were. But it's very clear that when we start accessing alternate rule sets, there's a signal that quiets the body in some ways and position.
Is that partly how you calm yourself down?
That's right. It is how you calm yourself down. And again, you have the clinical background, not I. But I'll confess I've been in therapy enough to know that occasionally, one feels as if you're accessing some piece of info as the patient side. I can only report from the patient side. Accessing some what feels like important piece of information. You're pulling on a thread of some sort, but then the therapist will say something, and it literally gives you that alternate view. And this notion of looking at things through a different perspective, we often think about that as a switch in our cognitive frame, in our thinking. But also, we now know there's this parallel signal that's sent to the body in which, in order to access these alternate rule sets, new ways of looking at things, there's a calming signal literally sent to the body as well. And I find this conversation fascinating because normally we just think about anxiety and exploration and rule setting and rule responses or responses to rules, et cetera, as a kind of the body sends signals and the brain does all this, what neuroscientists have always talked about as top-down processing. Right, just sort of suppress the hypothalamus, control the limbic system.
Right.
And that's true to some extent, but it's clear there are signals being sent to the body in parallel. And rather than look at the signals...
It's more like conducting than suppressing.
Exactly.
Like conducting, like an orchestrator conducts.
Exactly. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that takes place in people that have chronic anxiety, or for people who essentially stop accessing alternate rules and responses to these signals. And this is, I think, what is showing up in chronic anxiety, certainly in certain forms of depression, and when people enter states of rage and dysregulation, is that normally we know based on neuroimaging that the prefrontal cortex is essentially leading the response of this anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. So information is coming up from the body into the insula and then being fed to the prefrontal cortex. But then the prefrontal cortex is actually in a position to lead responses. And it essentially is acting like the coach of a team. And the team is all these structures like the ACC and the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, the heart rate and so forth. What happens in individuals who have chronic anxiety or damage to the prefrontal cortex or dysregulation of these circuitries is that order actually reverses. The insula and ACC start leading and directing the response of the prefrontal cortex. And I think, we see this I'm sure you've seen this clinically in individuals. And while this isn't necessarily a discussion about society at large, I mean, we see this in dysregulated arguments and dysregulated combat where people is essentially losing themselves and they default to what appears to be very primitive rule set. And it may or may not be the appropriate one.
Yep.
But you and I, of course, have the good fortune of knowing a number of people who've worked in special operations and things like that. And you talk to any of those individuals, and they know from experience and from training that their ability to access multiple rule sets and options in the moments of extreme autonomic arousal is actually where their power lies, right? It's or a combat fighter, or let's just take, or in debate, right? Something that you're far more versed in than I am, right? Although I guess every academic has to deal with a bit of that coming up, thesis defense, et cetera. In a really good debate, you can't allow the autonomic response to overtake you, or you lose access to an enormous database that resides in one's hippocampus, and you essentially, one then defaults to the bodily state, right? And this is what we see when we see people become dysregulated in rage, et cetera. So if we were to zoom out and then ask, where is the line between exploration and anxiety? I think that we can check off a few boxes for sure. First of all, that autonomic arousal, this tendency to be more alert or more in action than in non-action, is a very healthy response. I mean, the moment adrenaline is released from the adrenals, and as you know, there's a parallel signal in the brain. You get adrenaline released from the adrenals if you get in a cold shower or somebody says something triggering or you are afraid of heights or something. But the brain has its own kind of adrenaline system, which is this structure in the back of the brain called locus ceruleus. And it basically it essentially sprinklers the entire brain with noradrenaline and adrenaline. It's a very interesting system. It lacks specificity. It basically wakes up the whole brain. If I were to put a little, if I were to label the connections of the locus ceruleus, it's basically connected to everything. It just kind of sprinkles a caffeine-like substance on the entire brain, wakes you up. The adrenals in the body wake up the body. So two parallel systems wake us up.
Is that associated with the orienting reflex?
Yes.
If you orient, does the locus coeruleus wake up the brain?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a key component of the so-called reticular activating system.
Reticular activating system.
Yeah. Yep. And incidentally, I should mention this because I was going to come to this later, but I think it's relevant now. If somebody has a lesion in their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or if you transiently inactivate it with a technology, a non-invasive technology like transcranial magnetic stimulation, they can now just put a magnet on outside the skull and quiet that area of the brain transiently. In animals or humans, what you find is that person or human becomes incredibly accurate at any motor task. So for instance, if I were to give you a shooter game where you're supposed to shoot targets and you're shooting targets, you'll have some hits and some misses, like anybody. If I inactivate your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, your accuracy goes through the roof. It's near 100%. But the one thing you can't do is decide whether or not you're shooting an enemy or a friend. So you can no longer establish rules. You just become very good at execution of the motor behavior. Similarly, in an animal or person without a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex,
you see a trade-off there, right, between specificity and flexibility.
That's right. And so we see this theme over and over again, where as a purely, sensory motor response machine, the prefrontal cortex isn't even necessary. In fact, if you get rid of it entirely, people become like machines. If I click over here, somebody has no prefrontal cortex, basically everything becomes a stimulus. A puppy, everything's a stimulus. I used to have a bulldog. When he was a puppy, you had to worry about leaving cords out and everything went into his mouth. By the time he was, a year old, in part because he was a bulldog, he just kind of lay there. Like you could put a toy in front of him and he wasn't into playing and just leave it alone. A baby, everything's a stimulus. Many adults become infant-like in their responses, right? When anxiety is high. In fact, I have a friend who's a psychologist. Tell me if you agree with this statement or not, that anxiety makes children of us all. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly has been my experience that when feeling anxious, I don't struggle with chronic anxiety, but I certainly have felt anxiety.
Talk about dopamine, focus, and motivation, and how to manage our dopamine hits, because it seems like every 30 seconds we're getting dopamine now, whether it's drinking coffee, having candy, social media, email pings, dings on the watches, whatever it is, it's a dopamine overload, it feels like.
Yes.
So how do we stay motivated and manage dopamine at the same time?
Yeah, great question. So dopamine is the molecule of motivation. And
the molecule of motivation.
Absolutely. I mean, for years and years, people thought dopamine was about pleasure, but dopamine is mainly about craving and motivation and drive. So here's the experiment. Take two rats.
Yeah.
You give them a lever they can press, and they can get food out of that lever. They can get heat if their cage is cold. They can get all sorts of things that are great for a rat, including a mate to mate with if they press this lever. Both rats press the lever just fine. Now you take away dopamine from one of those rats. You can actually do that by using a toxin that can kill off all the dopamine neurons. Okay, there's an equivalent experiment that's been done in humans, but it was a naturally occurring death of these dopamine neurons, much in this same way that Parkinson's destroys dopamine neurons. What you find is that both rats or both people still experience pleasure from food, from sex, from warmth when they're cold, from cool when they're too warm, etc. However, if you take that rat, both rats, and you move them one rat length away from the lever, so they have to just do a little bit of work in order to press the lever. Or you take a human who has no dopamine neurons or very little dopamine, and you make the pleasureful thing a little bit more challenging to get to. The ones with no dopamine do not pursue pleasure at all. That's just one example of what now are hundreds of examples in the neuroscience literature showing that dopamine is the molecule of pursuit, craving, motivation, drive. Pick your favorite word.
So dopamine is a good thing in motivation.
Provided it's in proper levels,
Right.
yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay.
If your dopamine is depleted, you will feel not motivated. Now, there's a double-edged sword here because many things, as you mentioned accurately, trigger dopamine release. Seeing a positive comment, a compliment, food, the more palatable a food, a really tasty chip compared to a slice of a potato that's baked but doesn't have anything on it, one truly releases more dopamine than the other.
Right.
I could list off a number of things, but we have a baseline level of dopamine. Nicotine, for instance, increases that by about 50%.
Gives you more dopamine.
More dopamine is released. You have two major dopamine pathways in the brain. There's one related to movement, one related to reward. So nicotine, about a 50% increase. Cocaine, 100% increase, a doubling. Methamphetamine, 1,000 or even 1,000-fold increase.
Holy cow.
So huge increase in dopamine.
That's why it's so addictive.
So addicted, but what happens after that big dopamine increase is that the baseline levels of dopamine go below what they were before. How low that drop is below baseline is proportional to how big the increase was before.
That's why it's so addictive to stay on these things.
That's right. Well, and that's why if you're getting lots of little dopamine hits from things, as we call them, you're going to feel kind of depressed, and those things don't feel as rewarding anymore. Okay, now eventually the system can reset if you don't indulge. So if people are feeling bored, unmotivated, unstimulated, most of the time it's because they are overindulging in things that keep pounding this dopamine system, but the baseline of dopamine is going down, 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 down. Now there are a few hacks that can actually help, and Anna talks about some of these in her book. The main thing is if someone is engaging in any truly addictive behavior or substance, or a behavior that just doesn't feel like it's that great, but you're finding yourself doing it compulsively. But if you allow yourself 4 hours a day on social media, you'll probably find that you're scrolling, you're not even sure what you're looking for.
Like, what am I doing? Yeah,
Exactly.
I just wasted this time.
Exactly. And what you're looking for is something to jolt that baseline. So you want to limit those behaviors, or in some cases, if it gets really severe, like it was for this individual, you want to eliminate.
Completely, for 30, 60 days.
Ideally, it's 30 days. Now, this is the same prescriptive that they give alcoholics, heroin addicts, etc. But some of those drugs, of course, have actual withdrawal symptoms that can be problematic. These days, I'm not a pot smoker. I've never liked drugs or alcohol. I kind of lucked out that way. But and I'm not trying to demonize. I'm not passing judgment. But cannabis, for instance, is pretty in prominent use, and a lot of people. The idea of 30 days without that is, I think they probably say they could do it, but it would be very challenging for them. And I'm not here to tell people what to do, right? And there's about drugs, alcohol, or anything, but the idea is 30 days of no interaction with that thing, person, behavior, all sorts of things, so that you can enjoy other things. I like to say, addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. And if I may, enlightenment is a progressive expansion of the things that bring you pleasure.
Right.
All of that hinges on this dopamine system. So you have to be very judicious in your interactions with things that deliver pleasure, or else they will soon not deliver pleasure, and they will diminish your pleasure for everything else that you interact with. So the way to think about this is just to set up constraints. And as I'm stealing Anna's words left and right, forgive me, Anna, she has many more important things to say, and she says them much more eloquently than I, but she says, we don't give our kids chocolate cake for breakfast. But we sort of understand that dessert comes at a certain time of day and after completing certain things. But for some reason, we just allow ourselves to just dive into this immense dopamine sensory landscape of social media. Because social media isn't just comments, you and me saying, oh, like Lewis put something up. There's that stuff's great. But then there's also a lot of violent stuff, politically intense stuff. There's a lot of friction. There's a lot of joy.
Yeah.
I mean, you're essentially going to the dopamine carnival. And so you need to restrict the amount of time.
Yes.
And especially if you're somebody who wants to get work done and your work is not the social media. And I'm pointing at social media, but this could be anything. Anything that you enjoy. Food, for instance. You don't want to overindulge in highly palatable foods. It's just bad for us. We know this for a number of reasons. So the key is to Take this dopamine system and set it up for you to be able to be motivated and focused. And the way to do that is to make the experiences around that thing that you want to be motivated to do a little less or a lot less exciting.
What do you mean?
This is why I don't listen to music these days or check text messages while I'm in the gym. And sometimes I'll listen to a book or a podcast, but I really try and just work out, including while I'm running. Why? Because these days we are layering in dopamine. We're getting dopamine from the energy drink we're drinking, okay? Big increase in dopamine. I forget the actual numbers, but I think it's 1.8 times increase. And some of them have L-tyrosine, which is a dopamine precursor. Some of them have caffeine, which also increases dopamine and upregulates dopamine receptors. So you're getting it from the energy drink. Plus, it's the video game you're playing. Plus, you're with your friends. It's just a dopamine soup, which sounds great, except that other things that you do afterwards are going to seem understimulating. And you're going to think, I can't focus on this.
Yeah.
So I also kind of wonder whether or not you were having trouble focusing in your class because the Canelo fight was that awesome.
It was insane.
It was
amazing.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's amazing. And so I think it may be helpful for people to understand that the postpartum depression that people feel after a big celebration,
It's real.
that's real. And if you just wait a little while, that system will reset. You don't have to necessarily wait 30 days, but if you just had a great party, you should expect that there'll be a long tail of joy, but then you might feel a little low, a little underwhelmed.
So true, man.
And if you're going to sit down and try and do work and you're finding yourself not that focused, you might want to think about some of the behaviors that led up to that work. So I really try to get into my work in a focused way by making the period right before it's a little boring. Frankly, going outside, getting some sunlight, drinking my mate, it sounds like a pretty boring life, right? It's not like blasting a bunch of music and getting really amped up. But I'm able to get a nice peak of dopamine during that work bout. And I think that's a functional dopamine increase. And then afterwards, yes, indeed, there's a drop. Now, there's some other hacks that Anna's talked about. And again, we can look to our friend Wim Hof. Other people have done this, although this was happening long before Wim. There's a beautiful study published in the European Journal of Physiology showing that getting into cold water, so this could be cold shower, could be ice bath, could be any number of different plunge type things or an ocean or whatever that people want to use, for anywhere from 3 to 6 minutes, creates a 2.5x increase in dopamine that lasts many hours. So it's a unique stimulus because it's not like a spike and then it drops. It's like a long arc increasing your baseline dopamine, increases alertness, feelings of well-being. They did blood draws in this study, so these are real data. You know, they weren't.
Yes.
It wasn't conjecture. They really know this. And there are some cases of people who were full-blown addicts or people who are struggling with ADHD who start doing regular cold water exposure, 3 to 6 times a week, 3 to 6 minutes at a time, and discover that, wow, they actually can focus because they're getting that dopamine increase.
Wow.
Yeah.
This stuff is fascinating, man.
It's really interesting. I think that to me, because the dopamine, coming up in neuroscience, I've been in the game a long time now, almost 30 years. But dopamine was always thought of as like pleasure, but it's confusing because it's associated with pleasure, but it's not the actual experience of pleasure. And immediately after sex, immediately after any powerful experience that's very pleasurable, dopamine system crashes down. Yeah.
What happens in the body when dopamine crashes?
Well, there's an interesting thing that happens because there's a hormone called prolactin, which is actually involved in milk letdown for nursing, but is also increased in both men and women in anticipation of childbirth. This is actually responsible for the so-called dad bod. Prolactin lays down body fat stores, tends to make people a little more sedentary, and this has been shown in humans and in animals. It tends to reduce libido and sex drive. And so if you think about dopamine is a currency of motivation that biology has used for hundreds of thousands of years. So, whether or not, we think about currencies like dollars or euros or bitcoins or Ethereum, all of those actually relate to dopamine. Dopamine is the fundamental currency that we're all working for. And dopamine has this quality of making us focused on things outside our immediate experience. This is why people who are on cocaine or methamphetamine, which is a really extreme version of dopamine increase, they tend to be all about plans and action. They're not sitting there thinking about how wonderful they feel in their own body. Whereas drugs like cannabis and psilocybin and drugs. These are not drugs that I recommend people use recreationally. I'm not passing judgment, but I just want to be clear about what I'm saying and not saying. That any drugs that increase serotonin tend to make people kind of still, focused on their internal landscape, their thinking. It's kind of an internal reflection thing. So the serotonin system and the dopamine system are kind of antagonistic to one another. And the prolactin system is associated with the serotonin system. So prolactin is kind of about, it's a mellowing out.
Interesting.
And just to nail the point, there are many people in the world who suffer from schizophrenia, 1% of the world's population, a huge number, a very sad thing, psychosis, hearing things, etc. And most of the drugs designed to treat schizophrenic psychosis are drugs that reduce dopamine. And oftentimes you'll see people on the street who are taking these drugs and they'll be writhing like this with their face. Sometimes men will have gynecomastia, they'll have breast development because these drugs block dopamine, increase prolactin, and disrupt the motor pathways that are associated with movement.
Wow.
I say this for two reasons. One is it illustrates the relationship between prolactin, dopamine, movement, etc. But the other is to hopefully invoke a little bit of empathy for people that oftentimes we will see people who, if they're shouting and acting crazy, that's probably an unmedicated person who's bipolar or has schizophrenia. But if you see someone in their catatonic or they are writhing and acting very strange, that's a person who's, we don't know for sure, but very likely is actively trying to treat their own psychosis to eliminate the voices and things of that sort. So I say that because we have a big homeless population issue in California and elsewhere too. And oftentimes we see people acting crazy and we think, oh, they're, we make this disparaging judgment, and everyone's prone to doing it, of course, but they're crazy. But oftentimes those crazy movements and the things they're doing are the reflection of drugs that block the dopamine system.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to make it dark, but I think that there is 1% of the world's population is a huge number.
That's a lot.
And a lot of people suffering from these things. Yeah.
Now,
But now I want to get to how do we spike intentionally? You've talked about we can spike testosterone, but I want to know, can we spike dopamine?
Yeah, so, and you've done this. So your example of craving is actually what you crave. You crave the feeling of craving. Is beautiful because what it means is that you don't allow yourself to go so far down the arc of the dopamine trajectory to get to the other source of motivation. So there are two sources of motivation as it relates to dopamine, and then we can think about tools that we could export from these that are nested in neurobiology. The first is to do what you do, which is to be able to sense the craving as its own form of pleasure. This has kind of remnants of Carol Dweck's growth mindset that you eventually develop a pleasure in the seeking and the striving. Has has flavors of a David Goggins type approach where it seems like he gets pleasure from the friction itself. And so there are elements of that. You seem to have that as well. But if you can start to identify the craving as its own internally released drug, this thing dopamine, that is a source of motivation, then what you realize is that capturing the reward is wonderful, but attaching dopamine to the reward is actually a little bit dangerous.
Attaching.
Yeah,
this is
celebrating the win more than the pursuit, it actually sets you up for failure in the future. And so this gets us right into something called dopamine reward prediction error. And reward prediction error is basically if you expect something to be really great, and then it's not quite that great, your dopamine baseline lowers. And now understanding what we know about dopamine, that means that not only did you feel as if you lost because it wasn't as much a celebration as you thought it would be, but it also means that you're starting from a lower place, meaning you are less motivated. Now, the simpler way to conceptualize this is, I have a colleague at Stanford, she runs the addiction dual diagnosis clinic at, her name is Dr. Anna Lemke. She has a book called Dopamine Nation that's out right now. And she's really described this pleasure-pain balance, where anytime you have a bunch of dopamine and you're in pursuit, after you achieve a win, now this could be a business win, a relationship, a win of any kind, but inevitably there's going to be a tipping back of the scale on the pain side. And that pain side is always going to go a little bit higher than the dopamine side. So this is what you would feel if you pursued a goal like building a big company. Here it comes, the big sale. And then there's the, well, what now? The kind of letdown. Now, if you wait, If you simply wait and stop pursuing dopamine for a short while, the scale starts to reset. The problem is a lot of people immediately roll right into the next pursuit. And then what happens is that scale starts to get stuck on the pain side. A little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And pretty soon, no amount of seeking will allow you to experience that craving and motivation. So what does this mean in terms of an actual tool? Well, first of all, if people can do what you do, they're going to be in a much better position in life. Doesn't matter if it's school, sport, relationship, any domain of life. If you can start to register, that craving and that friction and that desire, that almost kind of low level of agitation, sometimes high level of agitation, that is that I'm trying to impose my will on the world in a benevolent way, we hope, that's dopamine. It's working with its close cousin, which is epinephrine, which is adrenaline. They are very close cousins. In fact, dopamine manufactures epinephrine. A lot of people don't know this, but adrenaline is actually made from the molecule dopamine. Okay, so those two are hanging out together. It's like crave work, crave work, crave and work, crave and work, crave and work. And then you get the win. And some people allow the big peak in dopamine to be associated with the win. And smart people learn to adjust their celebration internally, right? This is all internal. You could throw the biggest party in the world, but as long as you're kind of laid back and looking at this, not letting yourself get manic crazy, you won't necessarily crash as hard. And pretty soon, your system will reset so that you take the day, you clean up the dishes, you relax, you go, what now? I'm feeling a little low. Well, rather than going out and spiking your dopamine again, just wait. Understand that the scale will reset again. Give yourself a few days where you're going to feel a little kind of underwhelmed. Things aren't going to be as interesting. It's going to be hard to trigger that big release because you just had the peak. Well, if you adjust that, you relax, you understand there's always a little bit of a postpartum depression. We sometimes hear about postpartum depression. That's a clinical thing, but there's always that kind of, today's not as exciting as the previous days. What am I going to do with my life? But then if you let it start ratcheting up again, then what you realize is your capacity to tap into dopamine as a motivator, not just seeking dopamine rewards, that is infinite. And I can say with great certainty that this is how you were able to build a big company and sell it, how you've been able to build a successful podcast and sell it, how you're constantly seeking, because seeking is the reward. And I think for most people, we think of the reward as the finish line. And so the key is to get to the finish line, step into the end zone, but no end zone dance. It's just like, yep, and now I'm gonna go do it again. That's really the key. That's the key to doing it over and over. And when I see big athletes or academics or anyone or musicians and they rise and crash, it's clear they've lost the touch with the motivation evoked dopamine. And they've lost touch probably because it hasn't really been described by the neuroscience community until Anna has started talking about this stuff publicly. And I'm echoing what she's beautifully said much better than I am, which is that you should always expect that after a bunch of pleasure, there's going to be that low and then that craving. How do I get back to there again? And the key is you have to walk the staircase again. You don't get to do this as a square wave pull. You don't get to just ascend. It's always up, down, up a little bit higher, down, up. That's the function. So I don't know if that resonates with your experience. If you expect it, that's great because you eliminate the downside of the reward prediction error. Reward prediction error can also be conceptualized as, I tell you we're going to go to this restaurant, I keep building up the food. I actually raise the expectation and the requirement that food be really spectacular. Better off I just tell you it's going to be pretty good and then you're wowed by it, right? Because if your dopamine was higher in anticipation than the actual food evoked, well then it makes sense why you're always integrating over the dopamine release you had previously. Now, there are a couple of things that you said in there that I want to highlight, which I find so interesting, and we can get a little bit Eastern philosophy, mystical here, but tie it back to some real neuroscience, which is, you said, that's the juice, the motivation is the juice. If you look at Eastern philosophy and they talk about chi, and this, what is that? I wager that is dopamine. The desire to pursue things and to create more of oneself and as a species, whether or not you decide to have kids or not, those circuits all use the one universal currency, dopamine, of wanting more things that are outside the confines of your skin. And that's what's driven forward evolution of individuals and families and cultures and our species as a whole. And again, the circuitry has been there for many, many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's highly conserved. And so what that means is that it doesn't matter if it's Bitcoin or Ethereum. It doesn't matter if it's putting rockets on other planets. It doesn't matter if it's building the first automobile. It's the same currency. So understanding those cycles is really key. The other thing is the element of pain. I think that understanding that pain and pleasure are in this really dynamic balance can also help us, which in the following way. Any pain that you feel, the longer day, the less sleep, the kind of agony that things aren't working, that power outlet doesn't work, or the internet is slow, whatever it is, the amount of pleasure that you will eventually experience is directly related, to how much pain you experience. So we know this from actually what nowadays would be considered quite barbaric and unethical experiments, where they would give people electrical shocks and they would measure their response. And then they'd say, we're going to increase it. Eventually they get to the point where a shock that was previously very painful actually evokes a sense of pleasure. Now, you couldn't do these experiments anymore. These are not the experiments I do in my lab. These are older experiments. But for instance, and this has been discussed in scientific research papers, giving somebody a 10-minute ice bath, for instance, or even a 3-minute ice bath, or a 1-minute ice bath is quite painful. But there was a study from the University of Prague, European Journal of Physiology, showed that after a painful ice bath stimulus, the amount of dopamine release goes up for 2.5 hours to 250% above baseline. And that's not because the ice bath itself evokes dopamine release. A lot of people think, oh, cold water evokes dopamine release. No, pain evokes dopamine release after the pain is over. Yesterday, I tweaked my back because I do this stupid thing every few years, the same stupid thing, and it's really painful. And then you just remember all the ways in which you can't move around. I was like standing up this morning, I'm like, and just walking is so painful. As the pain has started to dissipate, you get a little bit of a high, right? You get a little bit of a euphoria. That's dopamine, because of the degree of pain that you experienced previously predicts how much pleasure. So when you start a company down in the dregs and you're shoveling again, that's beautiful, because that means that the win that you achieve is going to be as good or greater than the one you had previously, in your case with Quest. And so we go back to this example of the person that's not motivated, that can't get off the couch, that doesn't want to do anything. Well, this is the problem. We remember the rat experiment? They are effectively the rat with no dopamine, but they can still achieve some sense of pleasure by consuming excess calories, by consuming social media. And look, I'm not judging, I do this stuff too, right? Scrolling social media. If you've ever scrolled social media and you're like, I don't even know why I'm doing this, it doesn't really feel that good. And I can remember a time where you'd see something that was just so cool, or you'd see something online. I remember this when TED Talks first came out. I was like, this is amazing. These are some, at least some of them are really smart people sharing really cool insights. And then now that there are like a gazillion TED Talks, I remember spending a winter in my office when I was a junior professor, cleaning my office finally, and binging TED Talks in the background, thinking this is a good use of my time. Pretty soon, they all sucked to me. I was like, this isn't good. So what you need to do is stop watching TED Talks for a while, wait, and then they become interesting again. And that's this pain-pleasure balance. And so for people that aren't feeling motivated, the problem is they're not motivated, but they're getting just enough or excess sustenance. So they're getting the little mild hits of opioid, it becomes an opioid system. And if you think about the opioid drugs as opposed to dopaminergic drugs make people rabid for everything. You know, drugs of abuse like cocaine and amphetamine make people incredibly outward directed, right? They hardly notice anything except what they want more of, more. It's bad because those drugs trigger so much dopamine release that they become the reward. It's very circular. Only the drug can give that much dopamine. Nothing they could pursue would give them as much dopamine as the drug itself. So there's that. And then there's the kind of opioid-like effects of constantly indulging oneself with social media or with video games or with food or with anything, to the point where it no longer evokes the motivation and craving. And this is really the new evolution of the understanding of dopamine in neuroscience, which is that dopamine itself is not the reward. It's the buildup to the reward. And the reward has more of a kind of opioid bliss-like property, which itself is not bad if it's endogenous, released from within. But when we can just sit there like the rat with no dopamine, gorging ourselves with pleasures, so to speak, what you end up with is somebody that feels really unmotivated, and those pleasures no longer work to tickle those feel-good circuits. And so there's no reason for them to go out and pursue anything. And that's a pretty dark picture. So the keys are to pursue rewards, but understand that the pursuit is actually the reward if you want to have repeated wins, okay? The celebration has to be less than the pursuit. And that's hard for some people to do. It's got to be that your celebration is slightly less dopaminergic. It can be very reflective. You can be in gratitude. Those are other neurotransmitter systems, but you don't want to be on that high as you celebrate the win. You want to be trickling out your dopamine regularly until you pursue things. And then just understand there will always be a crash of pain. And the more pain you experience, the more dopamine you can achieve if you get back on the avenue.
It's been a while since I've reviewed the neuroscience literature pertaining to both anxiety and exploration. And so maybe we could start by you laying out what you've discovered and how you're thinking about what you think anxiety signifies, how it's related to exploratory behavior, which I think you described as something approximating courageous approach, although you were talking about mice in that particular paper, and what you're thinking about with regards to the neural basis of these different behavioral and emotional responses.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I should mention that these days my laboratory mainly focuses on humans. We still do some mouse work, but we, in partnership with people in psychiatry, we're doing essentially equivalent experiments in humans. So I'd be happy to elaborate there. Many people perhaps, but not everyone, have heard of the autonomic nervous system, which simply means automatic. It's a bit of a misnomer because without going too much into the history of that, if you look back to the origins of medicine in the time of Galen and so forth, when they were first, dissecting cadavers and whatnot, there was this idea of a nervous system, or a portion of the nervous system eventually came to be that could control so-called vegetative functions, meaning that rate of digestion and the really what neuroscientists typically think of as boring stuff, but it's anything but boring. It's the stuff that keeps you from urinating while you're asleep, unless you're a very young child, right? And it's the stuff that keeps your digestion going as you command your attention to other things. The autonomic nervous...
Right. It's all the things that are too complex for us to think through.
That's right. And they are, as you point out, immensely complex. And, nowadays with all this interest in the gut microbiome and things of that sort, I mean, these are tremendously complicated operations that are happening generally below our conscious awareness and that are indeed vegetative. They can be controlled by emotion. We were all familiar with the idea that when we are emotionally distraught, that our digestion can be different or et cetera. But typically, we can't control, for instance, in a conscious way, the rate of our digestion or the speed of our heartbeat in any kind of direct way. We can have a particular pattern of thought to control those. But in general, those functions were thought to be vegetative and outside of our conscious control. And the name autonomic nervous system sort of swallowed and overtook the vegetative part. So it includes that, but also three main aspects of body to brain signaling. And those three aspects are heart rate, could be quickening or slowing of heart rate. We are and we can be very aware of that, some of us more than others. Gut and especially the chemical composition and the extent to which our gut is empty or full. So heart, stomach, and then rate of breathing and sort of depth of breathing, meaning how much air we have available to us. And I think the three main ways to think about the way that the brain and body communicate is that it's either going to be mechanical or chemical. Let's use the gut as an example. Your stomach can feel acidic, or it can feel nice and warm and fuzzy, whatever that is in a chemical sense. Your heart rate can feel like it's going at a rate that's appropriate for your circumstances. If you're running, it could be quick. And if you're sitting in a chair quietly at the doctor's office waiting to be called back there and all of a sudden your heart starts racing, then you would think, well, that's appropriate for that situation, but it's not uncomfortable, right? It's out of sync with what you are doing, which is sitting. So there's mechanical information and then there's chemical information. And with respect to your lungs, you can feel like you're out of air or you have plenty of air. You can feel like your breathing is labored or it's easy, or in the chemical sense that the air that you're breathing, your lungs are burning or it feels easy to breathe. So basically there's chemical and mechanical signaling from the body to the brain, and the brain interprets all of that. And we put all of that under the umbrella of the so-called autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system can really be best thought of along a continuum. And here I'll avoid complicated nomenclature, but I'll throw it out there for the aficionados. Some people have probably heard of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. That naming is a little bit misleading. Again, what we can really think about the autonomic nervous system as is a continuum, or more like a seesaw, of at one end is alertness, and at the other end is calmness. Right? That is translated to the so-called sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but I'll call it the alertness and calmness system just for sake of simplicity. So it's sort of like a seesaw, and it has different neural circuits, and basically whether or not you feel very alert or panicked or alert but calm or a little bit of anxiety, that's going to depend on the balance between this alertness system and the calmness system. If you're having a full-blown panic attack, then the alertness system is, it's as if the seesaw is tilted all that way. If you have if you're deeply asleep, well, then the calmness system is really tilted down. You could say that's a portion of the seesaw. This is all kind of obvious and dates back, 100 years or so, which isn't that long in the history of science, but we've known this sort of thing for a while. Okay, what's interesting and I think more relevant nowadays is to think about one's own interpretation of those signals and how that relates to anxiety and, as you pointed out, exploration, and then to think about where the nodes of control are. In this seesaw model that I'm putting forward, the seesaw has to include what I would call a hinge, a location in the middle in which you can voluntarily adjust the seesaw to either be more tilted toward alert or more tilted toward asleep. And for many people, they find that their overall level of autonomic arousal is either inappropriate or inadequate for the demands of their life. Inappropriate meaning their heart is racing, they feel more jittery, more as if movement would be the default and worry would be the default and anticipation is the default than is appropriate for their circumstances. Waking up in the morning and feeling stressed, for instance, immediately without any immediate cause or maybe stress about real life events. For other people, they feel more exhausted than they would like. They're having a hard time leaning into the pressures of daily life. Both of those, even though they have sort of polarized phenotypes, they look very different. In one case, over energized, and in one case, under energized. Both originate within the autonomic nervous system. And we can reliably say from work done in animals and humans that that is not the consequence of the alertness system or the calmness system being disrupted, but rather that hinge in the middle is dysregulated. And we now know what that hinge is. And this is based on work done by colleagues of mine at Stanford, in particular a guy named David Spiegel, who's our associate chair of psychiatry. He's done a lot of work, and it's actually his father did a lot of work in the application of clinical hypnosis, not stage hypnosis, but clinical hypnosis for the treatment of various things. But his work and some work in our laboratory now has shown that there's an area of the brain that you are familiar with, Dr. Peterson, which is the prefrontal cortex, and in particular, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you really want to get down in the weeds about it, that has direct communication with two brain areas that are absolutely critical for this issue of whether or not you feel right for your circumstances, whether or not you translate that into a curiosity and exploration, or whether or not you translate it into this thing that we call anxiety. And those two areas are called the anterior cingulate cortex. Again, I apologize for all the names, but the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. And I think if I were to make a prediction about what the buzzword is going to be in popular neuroscience in the next 5 years, it's not the amygdala, it's not the prefrontal cortex, it's the insula. The insula has a couple of different regions, but one of its primary regions, the front end, the anterior insula, is responsible for interpreting all those bodily signals. It essentially is a funnel for all those signals about breath rate, heart rate, conditions of the gut, whether or not your body feels ready to move or exhausted, et cetera. And that all funnels into the insula. And then also coming into the insula is information from classical areas like the amygdala, which are involved in threat detection and fear, and also emotion and memory. So the insula is really this incredible hub of information about somatic signals, about bodily signals. And then the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in particular, is in communication with the insula and literally makes a...
So let me ask you about that. So does that mean that, the body in some sense is reporting to conscious awareness? Now it reports unconsciously in all sorts of ways too. So it might report to the hypothalamus, which is a very low level brain control area, by the way, for those of you who are listening. It might report to the hypothalamus primarily unconsciously. But do you think it's the insula that's reporting on the nature of bodily states to the prefrontal cortex in a manner that allows us to be consciously aware of our body states?
That's exactly.
Is that part of that integration system?
That's exactly right. You're exactly right. The insula sits as a different sort of station in that it's reporting to the conscious areas of the brain, to the prefrontal cortex.
Right. So we can take our own physiological state into account then when we're envisioning plans, because part of what the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does is allow us to envision different possible futures. And those are plans. And you're not going to make a plan to run 2 or 3 blocks to get to the corner store if you're so exhausted you can't get out of bed. And you need a reporting mechanism that tells you what physical state you're in so that you can predicate your plans on that. You think the insula, at least in part, is responsible for formulating those representations or for reporting those representations.
That is exactly right. In fact, the animal data and the human data, both lesion data and reversible inactivation data, support that in humans. So you have that exactly right. And as you mentioned, the prefrontal cortex, it gets sort of thrown out there for everything. I think, nowadays people have probably heard of the prefrontal cortex and people hear about executive function, which of course is true. But if we were to really dial back and say, what is the prefrontal cortex in the position to do? It's a flexible rule-setting structure. How do we know that? I'm sure you are probably more familiar than I am with the classic Stroop task. You give somebody a bunch of cards with different words on them, and those words are written in different colors, and you tell the person, okay, just read the words to me. Ignore the color that they're written in, just read them. And so they're saying they're cat, dog, shelf, book, professor, student, etc. Then you quickly change the rules and you say, you know what, just tell me the color that the words are written in, but ignore what the words say. And people will do that, but there's a portion of time in which they slow down a bit. It's actually hard because you've done a rule switch. Much of life, as you know, and again, this is more your domain than mine, is about applying different rules in different contexts. Now, what we know is that the insula and the prefrontal cortex are both intimately involved in this conversation that establishes which rules are appropriate for a given situation. So for instance, if somebody were to say something that quote unquote triggers me, okay, I'll use myself as the example, right? Maybe someone will tweet something and I'll think, and I immediately want to respond in a way that I know I can kind of flip them on their back immediately. But then I think, maybe I want to refrain from that for any number of different rules or reasons, right? Well, then I'm starting to apply different rules. I'm starting to think about the context that's outside of the autonomic response. Because in a strict, very animalistic way, in other words, in the absence of an insula and a prefrontal cortex conversation, really the only thing an animal or human needs to do is just respond to their arousal in, it's either, you can either retreat, you can stay put, or you can fight, right? That's really the only three major.
And those are very fast responses generally. So
discovered that neuroplasticity is actually a feature of the nervous system, the brain, throughout our entire lifespan. The rules change a little bit in terms of how you rewire your brain. But if the question is, can a person change? Can you learn new things? Can you unlearn certain patterns? Can you overcome traumas at any age? So for people that want to change their brain, the power of focus is really the entry point, and the ability to access deep rest and sleep. The brain is basically designed to be customized in the early part of life, and then to implement those algorithms and that circuitry for the rest of its life. I think that, in terms of value of understanding the nervous system and where it can be steered, it's absolutely clear that the nervous system can change in response to experience. So this thing we call neuroplasticity is really that. It's the brain's ability to modify itself in response to experience. And I think it's important to understand that from birth till about age 25, the brain is extremely malleable in a kind of almost passive way where kids are exposed to things and the brain is just wiring up. I mean, the brain is really designed to adjust itself in order to be in concert with its surroundings and to optimize that, just the way we described it a minute ago.
Like the way that a child can learn a language very quickly,
or 3 languages.
Play the guitar or something like that.
Yeah, without an accent.
Right.
3 languages without an accent. It's remarkable. You try and do that after age 25. It's very challenging. And so the brain is basically designed to be customized in the early part of life, and then to implement those algorithms and that circuitry for the rest of its life. And so the brain can change in adulthood. And it can change provided that there's an emphasis on some perceptual event. So in other words, if you want to change your brain as an adult, let's say you want to be less anxious, you want to learn a new language, you want to be more functional in some way, presumably. The key thing is to bring focus to some particular perception of something that's happening during the learning process. And the reason for that is that there's a neurochemical system involving acetylcholine. And it comes from these two little nuclei down in the base of the brain called nucleus basalis. All day long, you're doing things in a reflexive way. But when you do something and you think about it very intensely, acetylcholine is released from basalis at the precise neurons that were involved in that behavior, and it marks those for change during sleep or during deep rest later. So for people that want to change their brain, the power of focus is really the entry point. And the ability to access deep rest and sleep. Because most people don't realize this, but neuroplasticity is triggered by intense focus. But neuroplasticity occurs during deep sleep and rest. And we can talk about how to optimize those different brain functions. One of the things that's really important also to think about how the brain works in terms of plasticity and all this stuff is what the brain really wants to do is also pass as much of what it does off to reflexive behavior as possible. So, so when we're talking about focus, I think it can get a little bit vague, but it might be useful to think about like what exactly is focus and what triggers plasticity. So the brain loves to be able to just do things, pick up coffee cups and drink and walk and talk and do things and not put much energy into it. When we decide to focus, what the brain really does is it switches on a set of circuits that involve the frontal cortex and nucleus basalis and some others, and it's trying to understand duration, how long something's going to last, path, what's going to happen, and outcome, what ultimately is going to happen. So duration, path, and outcome. You know, the events of early 2020 are a good example of this. One of the reasons why it's so exhausting to be alive in 2020 is because we are now having to pay attention to duration, path, and outcome. How long is this thing going to last? When are they going to open up all businesses? Did I touch that door handle? Does it matter? Who are the experts? Are there any experts? There are a lot of questions, whereas normally we can just move through life without having to do all that analysis. So if it's a simple example like trying to learn a new language or a new motor skill or a new way of conceptualizing something, maybe somebody's in a therapeutic process and they're trying to work through a trauma or something like that, duration, path, and outcome is built into the networks of the brain. We can do that very easily, but it takes work. And it almost has a feeling of underlying agitation and frustration. And that's because the circuits that turn on before acetylcholine are of the stress system. So when you or I decide we're going to learn something and really dig in, norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, is secreted in the brainstem and in the body, and it brings about a state of alertness. Then our attention, which is mostly a diffuse light, is brought to a particular duration, path, and outcome analysis. This would be thinking about what somebody is saying. What are they really trying to say? A hard passage of reading, a hard set of math problems, a challenging physical workout. When you do that, these two systems have to work very hard, and the adult brain doesn't really want to change the algorithms it learned in childhood. But if you do those two things, you have alertness and focus. The acetylcholine and the norepinephrine converge to mark those synapses for change. And so the way to think about neuroplasticity, if one wants to change their brain, is bring about the most intense concentration you can to something, and then later bring about the least amount of concentration to that thing. So I'll talk about that in a second, but there were some studies that were done at Stanford by a guy named Eric Knudsen that showed that plasticity in the adult brain, any age, can be as robust as it is in childhood, as fast and as dramatic. Wow. Provided the focus is there, and it's all contingent on this acetylcholine molecule coming from nucleus basalis. So you say, well, how do you do that? How do you get it?
Exactly.
Well, I've got friends that chew Nicorette thinking that's going to get them there because Nicorette is a nicotinic acetylcholine agonist, but that's going to globally increase acetylcholine. So I always tell them that's not the right approach. The right approach is to bring as much focus to a behavior or to a thought or to an action pattern. And there has to be a sense of urgency. So what Knudsen lab showed, and another lab at UCSF, Mike Merzenich lab showed, is that if there's a serious contingency, like in order to get your ration of food each day, you have to learn this thing, the degree of plasticity is remarkable.
Right.
But if there isn't an incentive, It just isn't going to happen. So these circuits in the brain that Mother Nature set up are designed to be anchored to a real need. And people always say to me, well, should I do something out of love and a real desire to learn, or should it be out of fear? But either one works. The sense of urgency is just acetylcholine. It's norepinephrine. That's all it is. The brain doesn't have a recognition of whether or not something is pleasurable or not until later. Once you start accomplishing your goal, the reward systems like dopamine start kicking in. But I think if people are interested in modifying their brain for the better, at least some, top contour understanding of how urgency and focus must converge for that to happen can be useful, because I think there's a lot of attention paid to whether or not something feels like flow, or whether or not it's what I call highly desirable states, or whether or not you can eat a plant out of the ground that will magically put your brain into a state of plasticity. And the answer is yes, such plants exist, but what's missing is the focus component. If that work is not done with a particular end goal in mind, you'll get plasticity, but you'll get plasticity in a kind of across the board. It's like learning a little bit of 9 languages all at once is not going to make you speak coherently in any one of them. So focus is the key.
Well, in my case, it took a fear circumstance, fear of becoming a permanent failure, to motivate immense change. And that was that circumstance. I do believe, however, that the best work, our most creative and best work, comes from a love of craft. But sometimes in order to find what you truly love, you have to be scared into setting off on a path to find it. And and that goes for relationships too. Sometimes to find the right relationship, or relationships, it could be friendships, romantic relationships, etc., one has to be like deathly afraid of having to remain in the relationship that you're in enough to leave. So neuroplasticity is absolutely real. It actually worked out that my scientific great-grandparents, 2 guys, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, won the Nobel Prize for neuroplasticity. Now, they weren't the people who discovered it. It had actually been described for centuries. People understood that young kids can learn more easily than adults can. But David and Torsten won the Nobel Prize for essentially formalizing and discovering the principles of neuroplasticity, how it works. And then some years later, mainly one guy by the name of Mike Merzenich, but there were others that worked with him, discovered that neuroplasticity is actually a feature of the nervous system, the brain, throughout our entire lifespan. The rules change a little bit in terms of how you rewire your brain. But if the question is, can a person change? Can you learn new things? Can you unlearn certain patterns? Can you overcome traumas at any age? The answer is absolutely, categorically, yes. How? Well, it's very clear that as a child, until about age 25, more or less, just passive experience will shape the brain, for better or worse. After about age 25, and again, these are not strict cutoffs, we can change our brain, but what's required is a marked shift in the neurochemical environment under which something happens. So one of the reasons why any traumatic event will forever be remembered, although, by the way, you can remove some of the emotional load of that, trauma does not have to be traumatic forever, is because when we see or experience something very intense of a fearful nature, there's the release of certain what we call neuromodulators, things like epinephrine, adrenaline, and other neuromodulators that cause a state shift in our body and brain. And the nervous system recognizes this as unusual, and as a consequence, in the subsequent days, there's reordering of the connections so that the brain can prepare for that event should it happen again. This is why we have what's called one trial learning. You go to a certain location, something terrible happens there. You will forever associate that location with something terrible. But there are tools, therapy and other tools, that can allow the emotional load to be removed from that so that you could go to that location and feel calm, no fear whatsoever. The good news is you can also learn anything you want to learn, provided there's a shift in this neurochemical environment. This is why when we are very interested and focused on something, 2 of the main requirements for neuroplasticity, we have to be alert and we have to be focused. We can't learn passively as adults. We can't just play, a lecture about
AI and large language models or neuroscience in the room, and then the knowledge doesn't just sink in by osmosis. But if we pay attention, and we're alert when we pay attention, there's a shift in the neurochemicals associated with that attention, what we call the catecholamines. It's 3 molecules, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, all which cause an increase in alertness, all which cause an increase in focus, a tightening of our visual field and our auditory field. So like cones of attention is one way to think about it. And then it sets in motion a bunch of biological processes such that if we get adequate sleep that night, maybe the next night as well, there's reordering of neural connections so that that knowledge, that new experience is consolidated in your brain. You are forever changed as a consequence of that experience. So when we hear that the brain is constantly changing, everything that we encounter changes our brain, that's not true. Why would the brain change unless it needed to, right? As a child, the brain is basically a template for change. It's trying to understand the environment and make predictions. And so that's true. Neuroplasticity is a cardinal feature of childhood and adolescence and the teen years. And just think about the music you listened to when you were a teen. No other music will ever have as much significance. And that's because as a teen, your body is flooded with hormones and neuromodulators. That the amount of meaning that comes from now seemingly trivial events when you're a teenager or adolescent is immense. That song meant so much, and it's because of the neurochemical milieu it creates in you. But as an adult, it takes a stronger stimulus, as we say. And if you were to fall in love as an adult or see something, a painting that just strikes you as just so unbelievable, yes, then you are forever changed. But just going to see a bunch of paintings at the Met doesn't mean that every single one of those paintings is forever stamped into your brain. The nervous system is very efficient in that way. It doesn't change unless it has to. And it always changes if it needs to in order to keep you safe. This is why there's an asymmetric influence of fear as opposed to just interest in terms of what will shift our brain. But it's nice to know that love and excitement and appreciation are very strong stimuli for changing the brain. And, I can kind of draw to mind conversations I've had with my good friend, Rick Rubin. I'll get accused of name dropping, but I'm very fortunate to be close friends with Rick. And Rick always talks about, how when you just see and experience something and you just have this love for it, it changes the brain. He's not a neuroscientist, but in many ways he's a neuroscientist. So in any case, you absolutely can change your brain, but you have to pay attention to the thing you want to incorporate into your brain. You have to be alert while you do that. And then you absolutely have to go get some rest, because it's during sleep and during meditative states and during rest that the actual rewiring of the brain occurs.